There are still people joining us, and that's fine. But I don't think I've actually introduced myself yet in this series. But let me start by introducing myself. I'm Doug Evans. I'm the director of the International Institute for Environmental Studies, and I'm really pleased all of you have joined us this morning, and for all the other lectures that you've joined us for. It gives me great pleasure today to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. William Vásquez. He's a professor at Fairfield University in the United States. And originally he's from Guatemala, and he's a professor specializing in development and environmental economics with a regional emphasis on Latin America. And his academic credentials include 4 master's degrees and a Ph.D. I've got to compliment you on your stamina doing 4 master's degrees. And has a PhD in economics from the University of New Mexico. He's worked as a consultant for the United Nations, international think tanks, and research centers in Central America. And his research portfolio includes articles on water and sanitation services in developing countries, renewable energy, non-market valuation of environmental resources and public goods, as well as household preferences for policies aimed to mitigate and adapt to climate change, sea level rise, natural disasters, etc. Dr. Vásquez has field research experience in Brazil, Colombia, Ecuador, Guatemala, Mexico, Nicaragua, Uruguay, and the United States, where he's implemented household and community surveys. He's also an active member of professional societies and frequently collaborates with non-governmental organizations in the research and development communities. In his spare time, he enjoys traveling, watching soccer, that's real football for those of us in North America, and with a cup of Guatemalan coffee at hand, which sounds very good. So with that, let us turn it over to you, William, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you, Professor Evans, for that introduction. Before we start, I would like to thank also the International Institute for Environmental Studies for facilitating this lecture series, Professor Druji de la Cerda for the invitation to be part of the series as well. And many thanks to Raquel Scott, who facilitated that as well, for her patience in trying to schedule this lecture, right? We have a difficult time trying to find a time slot, but finally we are here. Thank you all for that, and thank you for attending the lecture. So let's start with it, as Professor Evans was saying. I don't know if you noted there in the type of study that I have done. I'm not an expert in mangroves, right? But my expertise is on the economic valuation of goods and services that are not traded in a market setting, right? And that, of course, include ecosystem services. So I have done a couple of studies on mangroves and other studies on other areas as well. So my hope today is to contribute to the discussion about how we can value mangrove ecosystem services. So my apologies in advance if I said something that is not necessarily true in terms of the mangrove ecosystem services, but I'm gonna try to share with you what I have learned over the years regarding the economic valuation of ecosystem services in general. So let me share with you the screen here. And let me see, I should have this thing here, perfect. Okay. So I'm gonna leave my email here in case anyone wants to contact me later on with questions if we don't have time. But my intention is to leave open the conversation, right? Perhaps 20 minutes or so into the lecture, so we can all discuss right about these topics. Let me just read the outline here. We are gonna start with a small or brief description of the mangrove ecosystem services. Then I want to spend a little bit more time in the economic valuation of ecosystem services and what are the type of values that we can estimate, some of the methodology that we can use. And I'm going to try to apply that to mangrove ecosystem services. We are going to see some value estimates that have been published, over the years that we have access to in the literature. Just to see how different that can be and what is what we can learn, what is what we can do in terms of improving the estimates that we are currently providing. I want to present very briefly as well a case study that we have from Brazil. It's a little bit old, 2015, but it's going to help us out as well to see what other techniques are available that perhaps not, that can help also to estimate the value of ecosystem services derived from mangroves, and some lessons that I learned when I was preparing this lecture, right? I'm gonna just show you some quotes from some studies that really grab my attention, and hopefully with that, we are gonna spark a discussion, right? Questions, so we can all learn from each other. Well, let me start with this simple definition of what is an ecosystem services, right? So as defined in many papers and summarized in the study by Abor in 2012, which I'm gonna be using a lot in this lecture, right? It says economic services are the benefits provided by ecosystems to humans, which contribute to making human life both possible and worth living, right? So as professionals that try to estimate values for ecosystem services, we are often criticized, right? We have always these discussions with our colleagues from natural science because we believe, right, that these ecosystem services are centered on humans, right? So it's an anthropocentric approach that we use to estimate these ecosystem services. Yes, that is true, right? And as administrators of natural resources, right, the problems that we cause to environmental resources as well make us also responsible for improving, let's say, or managing in a sustainable way those ecosystems and their services. So yeah, let's keep going, right? So mangrove ecosystem services. We can, my colleagues before, Professor de la Cerda, Ferreira, Borges, right, they have done a much better job that I can do in summarizing those services. Right, just for the discussion here, let's review a little bit of what they have already said, right? So we can classify those ecosystem services in 4 types, right, of services: provisioning services, regulating services, cultural services, and supporting services. And you can see that the list in each of them is huge, right? Perhaps some of us, or at least people that we are not from the natural sciences, we are more familiar with firewood, for instance, or crabs, right, and fishing in terms of provisioning services. For regulating services, I think that storm protection and flood control and erosion control are gaining carbon sequestration, right, are gaining a lot of attention lately in the literature. Cultural services, unfortunately, in my opinion, have received little attention, right? And we will talk about it later on. Although when it comes to recreation and tourism, the ecosystem services have been studied extensively, or more than other type of cultural services, I would say, especially for traditional communities. And then we have supporting services, right? They are extremely important, but as we will see in our framework for total economic valuation, the supporting services are not directly valued because we value other resources or other goods, other services that those supporting services, as the name says, right, support, right, that they help in producing. Well, now let's start with the framework of total economic valuation, right? So we divide the total value of ecosystem services, right, in three. One is the use value, which can be direct or indirect. We will talk about it later on, right? The option value and the non-use value. And the definition of that, as you have it on your screen, right, is the willingness to pay for direct use of ecosystem services, right? That is the use value. The option value will be the willingness to pay for the future ability to use those ecosystem services, and the non-use value is willingness to pay to preserve ecosystems that the person will never use. Okay, so I would like to pause here a little bit, right? Because some of you might be uncomfortable, I would say, in terms of the willingness to pay question there, right? So as economists, when we want to estimate values for ecosystem services, we want to create money measures, right? Or monetary values of those ecosystem services. And we derive that by our willingness to pay, right? We might say, okay, I really value too much this particular good, but if I'm not willing to pay for that good, perhaps I'm not valuing that much, right? So the willingness to pay measure that we use is a monetary measure that can help us understand what is the value that we are assigning to goods and services, right? We are quite criticized again, right? Especially for our colleagues in the natural sciences because of that particular measure, right? In the introductory lecture, right, Professor De La Cerda was citing or was giving us information about the value or the global value of mangrove ecosystems. If I remember correctly, right, it was about $1.6 billion, right, globally. But he also commented, right, well, I don't believe, right, on those estimates, right, or I don't believe that, or he doesn't agree in putting a price, right, on these ecosystem services. And he's not alone, right? There are several of our colleagues that are not in agreement with this willingness to pay measure. Yet, for us as economists, is a way in which we can translate, if you allow me to use that word, the value that we are assigning to ecosystem services to a monetary measure. Well, then the total value is the sum of these three, right? The use value, the option value, the non-use value. Perhaps let's spend a little bit more time on the non-use value, right? That could be the least understood value out of these three. So why someone would pay for something that they wouldn't use, right? Well, there could be several motives that are sparking that type of values, right? That could be, one of those motives could be a bequest motive, right? I'm not gonna use it, but I know that that resource is gonna be providing perhaps services, right, or goods and services to future generations, right? Perhaps to my own kids, right? There are some things that I have seen being from Guatemala that perhaps my family, my daughters, my children haven't seen. And I would like those resources to continue existing just in case they can go and they can experience the same things that I did when I was there, right? So that could be a bequest motive. I'm not gonna use the resource, but I am willing to pay to either preserve it, right? Or yeah, to conserve that resource, right? Another motive could be altruism. I know that the mangroves are ecosystem that support the livelihood of many communities, especially in developing countries, traditional communities. And I might be motivated by that to be willing to pay to preserve those ecosystems as well, right? So those are some examples of how the non-use values are derived, right, or that we experience those values. How do we organize, or how we combine this ecosystem service view in a total economic value framework? Well, if we go back to the classification of the ecosystem services that we can derive from mangroves, and we go to the type of values that we have, which you have in the first column of this table, right? We have the use value, right? And I am dividing the use value in direct and indirect, right? The difference here is that I am using the resource directly. So in terms of provisioning, for instance, it could be crabs, right? If crabs is part of my diet and I am harvesting the crabs in the mangrove, that could be an example of a direct use value, right? But it can also an indirect value, right? In that case, the provisioning services might not be an indirect value, but the regulating services are. For instance, storm protection, right, or flood protection. We are not necessarily using the mangrove or directly using the mangrove, but we are using the protection that it gives us, right? So we can think about the mangrove as an input that is helping to produce a service, right? In this case, would be the protection against storms or floods, right? So if we take a closer look of this table, what we can learn here is that the provisioning services can be or derive a use value and an option value, right? But we don't have an indirect value of provisioning services or a non-use value. And that is important to keep in mind because that is gonna also determine what are the methodology that I can use to estimate those values. In terms of regulating services such as storm or flood protection, right? It is indirect use value. We can also derive option values from those services, but non-use values are not existent for those two particular type of services, right? In terms of cultural services, which may include recreation, may include tourism, right? May include I don't know, religious practices or things like that. In that case, we have a direct use of the mangrove, right? We can also derive option values and non-use values. And in terms of the supporting services, this is a little bit more difficult to measure because those supporting services, even though they are valuable, they are not directly observed by humans, right? But they are used or they have an effect on other ecosystems, they have an effect on other type of services that we can derive, right? Perhaps not directly or indirectly, but they can be seen as an input for other services, right? Or for other ecosystem services as well. Okay, so how do we value these ecosystem services? There are several methods to do that. I'm gonna provide some examples later on, right? In the next slide, I think, right? But we can classify those economic valuation methods in two big groups, right? One is the revealed preference methods. And the revealed preference methods are based on actual data, actual observable choices, right? That we can use to derive values. In that case, we are observing human behavior, we are documenting human behavior, we are collecting data on those choices, and based on that data, we can estimate values. Let me give you an example of that. If we talk about mangroves specifically, it could be that I can see, for instance, the price of crabs in a market, right? I can estimate how many crabs can be harvested, right, in a season in a specific mangrove. And then I can estimate the value of those crabs in that particular market, right? So in that case, I can observe human behavior, right? Humans are going, harvesting the crabs, they are coming to the market, they are selling that product in the market, and that that price, that market price serves as a value or as a monetary measure of the value that people might be assigning to the crop. So this provisioning service in this case, right? Other examples of revealed preference methods, but let me give you more examples in the next slide. Stated preference methods, right, are based on hypothetical scenarios. So most of these methods are based on surveys, right? Some of them are based on field experiments as well, right? And they are designed to elicit respondents' willingness to pay when values are not directly observable. They can be unobservable because of several reasons. One is because there is not a market for that specifically, right? Over time, I have learned to enjoy my time in the mangrove forest, right? But I don't have to pay for getting into a specific forest, right? When I am traveling and I am doing my studies, I like to walk around, or I like to take a boat tour perhaps, right? And get into the mangrove area and just observe the biodiversity. Well, it might be that I don't have data on how much I am willing to pay for that particular tour, or it might be that I don't need to pay for that, right? So when these services are not traded in market settings, then I'm not gonna be able to observe the values that I can observe in the revealed preference methods. And consequently, I need to come up with hypothetical scenarios to value those services. Okay? So here are some examples of the economic valuation methods that I was talking about, right? We further classified these methods in direct or indirect methods. And the difference between them is whether or not I observe the values directly or through the prices of other goods. So in terms of the revealed preferences, direct methods, we have the market price. I gave you an example, right? If we can value the amount of crops, right, that have been harvested in a season, for instance, in a particular mangrove ecosystem, that could be used as a value. Replacement costs is a method when we are estimating the cost of replacing the ecosystem that we are valuing, right? So it could be replacing it with more mangroves in this case, for instance, or it could be replacing a particular function of that system with other things, right? So if we are talking about storm protection or flood protection, it could be, for instance, it could be what would be the investment in infrastructure that I need to make in order to prevent that flood, right, to happen, which could have been prevented if I have the mangrove forest, right? So that could be an example of the replacement cost. Avoided damage, right? So several studies have used this approach to value mangroves. And an example of that is the protection against storms of flooding. And in this case, you can compare two areas, one that was protected by the mangroves, one that is not protected by the mangroves. You can see the damage that the same storm that hit both areas, right, had on the unprotected area. For instance, the damage that could have in houses in that area. And we can estimate the damage of that storm in that particular area. We can use that estimate as the benefits, right, or as the value of the mangrove, right, given that it avoided the damage that the storm or the flooding was producing in the site, right? More revealed preferences data is the travel cost. We can, through the cost or through the expenditures that people make to travel to a particular area, right, we can estimate the value of some ecosystem services in that area. Of course, we have to disentangle what is the cost that can be attributed to the ecosystem service, because people, when they go, they can have different purposes, right? They go from different sites. They travel in different means of transportation. So we need to control for all those differences. But at the end, I can estimate through those travel expenditures, I can estimate what would be the value of the ecosystem services that they are visiting, right? This is very applied, for instance, in value of beaches, for instance, is one application, right? So we can use those travel expenditures to derive implicitly from there the value of an ecosystem service. Hedonic property values. So from the value of a home, from the value of a service, I can see differences to differences in the values that we are assigning to that property because it could be close to an ecosystem services. It is very it is most commonly applied, let's say, to measure lakes could be an example, right? A home that is the same home, if it is in front of a lake, is gonna have a higher value than a home that is not in front of the lake, right? That is further away. And we can see that difference in the value of the home as a value assigned to the lake itself, right? Same thing could be done with mangroves. If we think that people can internalize in the price of property, in the price of housing units, if they can internalize the fact that they are being protected by a mangrove area, that could also be an approach to measure the value of that particular mangrove forest, right? In terms of the stated preferences, we have as an example the contingent valuation. And basically the contingent valuation in a simple way is asking people how much they are willing to either preserve, either conserve a particular area, right? How much they are willing to pay. The choice experiments are similar to the contingent valuation with the difference that we have attributes that are given to different options, and we ask people, and remember this, all of them are hypothetical scenarios. We ask in that hypothetical scenario, we ask respondents to choose one of those options, right? And those options can vary in attributes. So the attributes, one of these attributes could be, for instance, a particular service, right, that the mangrove is providing to them, right? We are gonna have, I'm gonna show you an example of a choice experiment that we implemented in Brazil several years ago. So you have a better idea of how that works, right? So as you can see, and this is not an exhaustive list, right? There are more methods that we can use to estimate the value of ecosystem services. But I'm just providing some examples here. I would like also to bring your attention to the benefit transfer function. So what is the benefit transfer function? When we cannot go and either observe the choices that people are making and implement one of these reveal preference methods, right? Or we don't have the funds, right, to go and collect stated preference data through contingent valuation of choice experiments. Researchers have a tool at hand as well that we call the benefit transfer values or the benefit transfer function. So how that works? We have an study site, so we go to the literature, right? We find an study site that is similar to the one that we want to study, to the one that we want to value. We use the values that are estimated in that other site, and we use those values to estimate the value of the mangrove forest that we would like to value, right? This is a less expensive way to do things, right? Because all that we need is the estimate that someone else already provided in the literature. And then, of course, we have to be careful on how we apply it, and there are, several guidelines, right, that we have to follow for that. But then we can use it to value those ecosystem services that we would like to do, right? It is practical, it is helpful, right? in my opinion, and in the opinion of some reviews that I studied while preparing this presentation, perhaps it has been abused to estimate the values of mangrove areas, and that might create some problems in the estimates, as we will discuss later. Okay, so valuation methods by type of service. So now here I'm just providing you with a list of, if you want to value the provisioning and cultural services, for instance, you have these techniques that you can use to your disposal. If you want to estimate indirect use values at the regulating services, you have these other techniques, right? We talk a little bit about them as well. And the only one that we have is for the non-use values of cultural services is the contingent valuation and choice modeling. Remember, both of them are stated preference data, right? So when we have, depending on what is our interest, right? If we want to measure direct use values, indirect use values, or non-use values, when we measure non-use values, ecological or environmental economists, we put ourselves in a tough position, right? Even though most of my research is using those techniques. And it is a tough position to be because a lot of people, right, or a lot of economists, I should say, right, don't like the fact that we are using hypothetical scenarios, right? The criticism goes that if we are using hypothetical data, then we are going to have hypothetical results, right? That area of the economic valuation methodology has developed a lot in the last 30, 40 years, right? And there are several studies that show that the contingent valuation and the choice experiments are really useful and suitable and appropriate to measure non-use values, right? Compared with observable data. So yet some economists don't use it, right? Or don't believe that, or we can say they prefer to have the observable data, which I also do, but unfortunately, in my case, I work in areas where that data is not available, right? So I have to generate that data, and the way to do it, or choice experiments and contingent valuation is a way to generate that data to observe choices, even though they are in an hypothetical scenario, right? Okay, so enough of the methodologies that we can use, right? And now let's look at some values actually that have been estimated that are in the literature, right? So I am borrowing that from DAS 2020, right? This is a recent study. They also borrowed these estimates from Salem and Mercer in 2012. So these estimates are relatively old, we can say. But I want to use this to notice a couple of things. First is the amount of services that we are valuing, or that these studies are focusing on, right? Notice that very few, if any, studies are valuing all the goods and services that mangroves can provide, right? They focus on one particular service, 2, 3 of them, right? I haven't seen a comprehensive study that is trying to value each of the services that a mangrove area is providing to surrounding communities. Right, so that is the first thing to notice. Then the other thing that I want you to pay attention to is the amount of studies that have been conducted here to value each of these services, right? The list of services is not as comprehensive as the one that I presented at the beginning, right? First point. And then among them, fisheries have received the most attention, followed by forestry and coastal protection, right? The other services have received less attention in the literature, right? So that means that these value estimates that we observe, or when we try to aggregate value estimates, we may be underestimating actually the value of the ecosystem services that mangroves provide, right? Okay, so then within each of these services, I want you to notice the variation in the values that are estimated, right? So for fisheries, for instance, the lowest value here is $10 per hectare per year, right? The maximum is $555,000 per hectare per year. This is a wide range, right? We need to study more about why those differences are, but in recent meta-analysis, right, there are a lot of that variation cannot really be explained by the methodology or the elicitation format that we are using, right? So there could be some concerns about how we are estimating these values and why they can be so wide, right? One of the reasons could be that we are using benefit transfer functions, and we are not being careful, right, in how we estimate those values, right? So if you look at the difference between the maximum and the minimum estimates, right, or if you look at the difference between the mean and the median, these values are just, this variation is just huge, right? If we compare across services, we also have a lot of variation, right? Forestry, fishery is right there at the top with tourism, right? And then we have coastal protection that follows that those services, right? So when we are trying to rank the importance of those ecosystem services, right, these might be useful, but we still have a lot of variation in these estimates. What someone could argue perhaps is the approach, right, that they are following in how to estimate that, right? Well, let's compare, right? So I borrowing from Barbier et al., right? So I come up with some, I borrow some of the estimates that they review in a recent paper. And I focused here on the protecting services that mangroves can provide, right? For Thailand, for Philippines, right? From Central America, so perhaps a little bit of variation in the areas, right? But similar services, similar valuation method, yet when you look at the value estimates are still different, right? If we compare the estimates from the Philippines, for instance, right, they don't fall in this range that Barbier is provided for Thailand. Again, some variation, we need to find out why we have that variation in those services. It could be easily that communities or the study communities are assigning different values to that, but we have to make sure about it, right? I also included this study here because by Del Valle et al., right? Because they are not comparing, or the comparison here is not in terms of monetary measures per hectare per year, perhaps, right? But it is a measure of how wide the mangrove area should be in order to truly attenuate the storm surge damage in that particular study, right? Okay, so what we have done in Brazil here, right? So I want to present a case study when we use the choice experiment, okay? And that is in an area or in two municipalities in the Rio de Janeiro state. The municipalities are São João da Barra and San Francisco de Itapapoana. I think the Professor Lacerda is more familiar with the area that I am, right? He has done some studies with a colleague of us, Carlos Eduardo de Resenge there. So this is a mangrove forest area that is in the mouth of the Paraíba do Sul river, okay? This area has suffered a lot from anthropogenic and natural destruction, right? And the idea was to value the restoration of that mangrove forest, right? If I remember correctly, Professor Ferreira was telling us a little bit about the restoration of mangrove forest areas a couple of lectures ago, right? So what is what we did in this study? Well, we designed a choice experiment, okay? And remember, I told you that the choice experiments can have different attributes. So in this case, we chose 4 attributes, right? We chose the attribute restoration, right? The time that would take to get that level of restoration that we wanted to achieve, right? And that restoration could be minimal, could be moderate, could be complete. I'm gonna tell you in a second what those levels mean, right? It would take between 0 and 10 years, 11 to 20 years, 20 to 40 years to get to whatever level, right, we are targeting in that case. In a second, this is gonna be clear. Notice here that we are using a wide range of years to achieve those levels because of the uncertainty that could be around how effective the efforts to restore the mangrove system may have. So we are accounting for that uncertainty by providing the respondents a range of years rather than a specific number of years. In this community, these 2 municipalities are relatively poor. They are really heavily depending, or some families are heavily depending on the mangrove. They wouldn't have money necessarily to pay. Remember, we wanted to have a measure of the willingness to pay. So if people don't have an income, right, if they cannot provide money, even though they value the service, they are gonna tell me that they are not willing to pay, right? So we included this voluntary work as a substitute for payment, right? Perhaps they don't have the money, but they might have the time to go and support the restoration efforts, right? And we decided that those restoration efforts were going to be led by an NGO, right? And as a payment vehicle, we chose a monthly contribution to the NGOs, right? This can be problematic for some economies because this is a voluntary contribution rather than a mandatory one. And it's believed that when we present these voluntary contributions, people are not gonna be truthful in responding to these questions, right? Yet we decided to do it like that because in a country like Brazil, other payment vehicles might be difficult or might be actually rejected, right? Like increases in taxes, for instance, right? In another paper, I used that as a payment vehicle, and what I found is that no one was willing to pay for protecting the coastal areas of the state against sea level rise because they believe that the money was going to be used with other purposes, right? So the perceived corruption of officials in Brazil is relatively high, so it doesn't allow us to use that as a payment vehicle, right? We are gonna find a lot of what we call protest responses, which might interfere with the estimation of the value of those services. So we decided to go with a voluntary contribution to an NGO. NGOs in the area have developed a huge reputation, right? There is a renowned NGO, for instance, that facilitated the introduction of the golden lion, right? So the sea turtles as well, right? There are other NGOs working with sea turtles, and those NGOs have shown that they are successful, that they are effective, and they have earned a good reputation in the area, right? So that's why we use also the NGOs as the administrator of this project. It doesn't mean that it has to be restricted to that. It can be more. We have also estimated value differentials with NGOs with respect to local or central governments, or even interinstitutional committees that can manage a resource, right? So a couple of lectures ago, Professor Borges, right, was telling us about the community-based approach to manage these systems. So that could be also integrated here and see if there are differentials in the willingness to pay or in the value that we assign, depending on who is administrating the project, right? So how these choice experiments look like? Oh, well, before we go to that, right? Let me just give you more information about what we mean by complete, moderate, and minimal restoration, right? And you can see here that we took two different aspects of the restoration, right? That will be aesthetics and the ecological services. So one of the problems that we faced when we were deciding how to value these services is that these ecosystem services in mangroves are related, right? We cannot say we are gonna improve the health of the mangrove area, and that is gonna have an effect only on provisioning services and only on regulating services, right? But they are interconnected, and it's very likely that if we improve the health of this mangrove forest, several of those ecosystem services are gonna start enhancing, right? They're gonna start showing up and people are gonna start using them, right? So to disentangle that was a little bit difficult for us. So we decided to frame the restoration efforts in complete, moderate, and minimal, and you can read here what we meant by that, right? So respondents were aware, right, and they were informed before making their choices about these restorations levels. So just as an example, let's read what complete restoration means, right? The mangrove reaches its original state with healthy vegetation and expanding forest, right? In terms of ecological services, that means that the mangroves would prevent erosion, right, and protect against storms. And they would also improve the provisioning services in terms of crabs and the fish population in the area. So we have that variation. We need that variation in order to learn how much the people value different efforts in the restoration of mangroves in this case. How those choice experiments look like? Well, what the respondent actually sees after explaining each of these attributes, right? We are carefully explaining these attributes before this, and then we ask them to perform some choice tasks here, right? We can repeat these choice tasks if we want, changing the levels of these attributes, but we don't change the attribute numbers necessarily, right? So let's say in this case, we presented this respondent with two options, option A, option B, and the option C is not doing anything, right? We are not gonna implement a program to restore the system, right? Please let me know if how I'm doing in time. Oops, almost there, okay.
Yeah, you're fine for time.
Okay, yeah, just running. I wanted to have some time for questions and discussion, but it seems like I am absorbing everything here. Okay, so let me see the example of the choice scenario here. So option A is complete restoration level, right? We would take between 21 and 40 years to reach that level. The respondent would have to contribute $10 a month and work 4 hours a week, right? The option B, the restoration level is less optimistic. We just reached the moderate level, but we would do that faster, 11, 20 years, right? They would have to contribute less and they wouldn't have to work, right, to reach that moderate level, right? And we can change all these attributes, right, in different ways. We have different combinations and I tend to present between 4 and 8 of these choice tasks to the respondents, so we have more data about how they would choose, right, among these attribute levels, right? So we have more observations and a richer data set. Okay, what we end up with? Well, these are our estimates. For modern restoration, for instance, if we achieve that in 10 years, people will be willing to pay in a year about 75 reais. At the moment of this study, the exchange rate was 3 reais per US dollar. So that will be about 25 US dollars, right? Or then if we achieve the moderate level of restoration in 20 years, the willingness to pay goes down, right, to 56 reals. It's even lower for 30 and 40. And if we reach it in 50 years, people wouldn't be willing to pay at all, right? So this speaks about the time frame that they, or the time preferences that people may have in order to restore mangrove areas, right? When it comes to complete restoration, we observe the same decreasing the same decreasing willingness to pay here, right, for the complete restoration. One thing that I want you to notice here is that what we found is that when it is achieved in 10 years, in fact, the willingness to pay is lower, right? The crossing point for this willingness to pay is at 29 years, right? And then we start looking that the complete restoration is actually more valuable than 40, than in 30 and 40 years, right, and beyond. So what that is telling us is that people may believe that the complete restoration cannot be achieved that soon, right? And that they trust, or that they would prefer a moderate restoration of the mangrove areas if it is made sooner, rather than a complete restoration, right? Because they don't believe that it's gonna be achieved in that particular time. But if we give it more time, right, the complete restoration becomes more credible, and then we find that they are willing to pay more for that thing, right? Okay, so let me finish with a couple of quotes that I like to share with you that really grabbed my eye when I was preparing this lecture. Right, so from Bo et al. In 2012, right, in this study, they say society is governed by money and numbers, and if we don't put a value on ecosystem services, they might be ignored in favor of the quantifiable, right? So this speaks to that criticism that we often receive about wanting to price everything. We don't want to price everything, right? We want to assign a monetary value to those ecosystem services so we can put it in the table, right? Along with other services, along with other goods, along with other societal needs, and demonstrate that mangrove ecosystem services in particular also have a value, right? In one of the reviews of this literature that I found, this is the conclusion by Himes and Cornell, right? It says most published studies focus on a small selection of ecosystem services, right? We demonstrated that with the table that we saw during the presentation, based on the availability of benefit transfer value. So here is when I'm thinking, okay, we are overusing the benefit transfer values, right? How we counteract that that shortcoming of the existing literature, we need more studies conducted at specific sites, right? And valuing a broader amount of services, right? Again, we are not gonna find data, right, for some of those services, but the cultural services that have received less attention in the literature are equally, or may be equally important in some areas. We also need to value those, even though there is not a market price for those resources, right? And there is when the stated preference techniques like the choice experiment, the contingent valuation can be used, because they capture the total economic value, including non-use values, even though they are hypothetical. And if we want to move forward, if we want to gain credibility for these estimates, right, according to Mukherjee here, we need to acknowledge the diversity in different evaluation approaches that we have. We need to develop standard methodologies, right, in order to standardize the methodologies. They exist. We just need to use it in a standard way in order to produce value estimates that are comparable across studies and across different areas, right, to have a better understanding of the value of these systems. Thank you all. I would like to open the floor for questions and discussions.
Yes, just let me take this opportunity to thank you, William, for an excellent lecture. And remind people that you can either put your microphone and or camera on and ask a question, or you can put it in the chat. Please don't use the Q&A because the only person who can see that is Raquel. So it'd be better if you have questions, put them into the chat. Well, maybe while people are getting their questions together, maybe I could ask you one, William. It goes right back to early in your talk when you were talking about total value. And I'm not an economist, obviously, so you can correct me here if I'm wrong, but it seems to me that there's a category that's missing there, which is what I might call inadvertent use or consumption of an ecosystem service. So I'm thinking about in the case of mangroves specifically, although I live in Canada and there are no mangroves anywhere nearby, I do benefit in some small measure by things like carbon capture. And so while my benefit is infinitesimally small, perhaps, when you then multiply that across a global population, it actually could become quite large. And I'm wondering how you factor those kinds of things into your calculations.
So that would be an indirect use of the ecosystem service, right? And we can do that. We can estimate, for instance, health functions, right? Measure health levels in populations and say, okay, populations that can be affected or that are closer to the mangrove forest area, for instance, right? They might be having a better quality, air quality, right? Or they have better water quality, and that can affect their health, right? So if we estimate health cost functions that can be related or that I can somehow estimate and point that is the forest, the one that is causing that, I can disentangle from the health cost functions the value, right, or the decrease in the cost functions, for instance, of that proximity there, right? Yeah. So yeah, we can do it. We do it often, and that would be an indirect use value of the resource.
Okay, we have a couple of questions that have been put forward in the chat. I'll just read them, but you can refer to them yourself. First one comes from Johan Stepani. Do you think NCP, nature's contribution to people, will ever overtake ecosystem services?
Remind me, Johan, what is NCP stands for? What do you mean by NCP?
NCP is like the new IPES thing for ecosystem services. It's just a new classification. Instead of the 3 or the 4, it does it 3. Maybe it's not important. I just thought you would have thought of that instead of, well, I don't know. I'm just trying to figure out why people use ecosystem services instead of this NCP, but I guess it's not relevant if you don't know what it is.
Well, it could be relevant, Johan. Remember that I'm not an expert in mangrove areas, right, or an ecologist in that sense, right? My expertise is on the economic valuation of those services. Without knowing that, I cannot really say, right, whether or not it's going to take over, right? But as economists, what I can tell you what we need is we need to start talking to you guys, obviously, right, and say, okay, what is what you mean by these frameworks, right? What is what you mean by these approaches? And then, as an economist, I need to translate that to something that people are gonna use, right?
Yeah.
Because remember, this ecosystem services is about how I benefit from that, right? So the approach that we use is, again, anthropocentric, right? So it's about how human beings can benefit out of the services, benefits, goods, right, that can be derived by these resources, if you want to call it like that, right? So the approach, I'm guessing, is going to be important, right? But for us is how do we translate that to benefits that as human beings we can experience out of that resource.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
We have another question from Sudeep might need a little bit of further explanation. Can you say something about restoration in aquaculture pond or agricultural land? I'm not sure if that's referring to ecosystem services in those environments, or that's what I say, Sudeep, you might want to clarify a bit.
Okay, okay, mangrove restoration. Okay, so I'm guessing that is the effect that aquaculture can have on mangroves, right? So yes, we can. So this is an interesting question, right? Because it poses a trade-off in the discussion, right? So on one hand, we might need that aquaculture industry in order to feed people, right? And I think that Professor Lacera was talking about that in the previous lecture, right, Drew? You know, when we talk a little bit about that in the previous lecture. So yes, we need that, but at the same time, we are learning, right, that the aquaculture industry in the way that is undertaken is affecting the mangrove areas, right? So that is one reason why it is important to value the mangrove areas, because in the estimation of or in the decisions to promote aquaculture, we are not taking into account the damage that can be causing on some environments, right, or some ecosystems like mangroves. So we will need to quantify first what is the effect, right, that is having on the mangroves. What are the ecosystem services that are being lost because of that damage? And we will need to value that in order to put it on the table and say, hey, yes, you know, we are benefiting from aquaculture, but here is another value of the services that we are losing because of that particular industry or because of the way that it is performed, right? Perhaps it could be more sustainable ways of doing it. I'm not an expert on the area, right? But it could be something that we may consider out of that, right? The importance of estimating the values here is to show policymakers, right, that there is a trade-off, right, and that it is a trade-off that is not being considered, and consequently, government intervention might be needed, right, in order to prevent those services to be lost, right? But the only way in which we are going to be able to put that on the table to discuss is if we can value the ecosystem services that are being lost because of the negative effects of aquaculture industries.
Do we have any further questions for our speaker?
I see one follow-up question from Sudeep. Sudeep, if you send me an email, right, you're going to find the email in the presentation, and I think that they're going to be posted in the website, right, Doug? Yeah, okay, yeah. So you can find my email there. Send me an email and I can send you some references that you can read to learn more about these economic valuation techniques.
Well, I see we're at about 5 after the hour. So final chance, if anyone has a further question that you'd like to ask our speaker. If not, excuse me, if not, Richard, do you have a question?
I have one question for William. I put in the chat, so but I can ask him. So the point of view of some ecologists' work in the conservation field, there are many restrictions about the evaluation techniques. And the point of view, the economic this approach can help a serious problem like environmental problems like deforestation, oil spill. Could you make some consideration about the theoretical point of view as well as the public policy, William, please?
Yes. A pleasure, Carla, to hear you. Yes, there are limitations, right? These economic valuation methodology is relatively new. If we compare that with other disciplines, right, it started in the 80s, approximately, right? So it's 30 years old. So we have a lot of work to do in order to learn more and improve more, although I think that is reaching a level of maturity that we can use and rely on those systems, right? The techniques that I was explaining in the presentation and the I didn't go deeply on the theory behind this, but the theory behind all these techniques are applicable to any ecosystem that we may want to think, right? So you mentioned oil spills, right? You mentioned what I don't remember what was the other example that you provided, right? But all of these ecosystem services that are being lost because of these damages, for instance, right, because of the intervention of human beings, can be valued with these techniques. And for me, the important part is, or the contribution that economics has to do to the preservation of ecosystems is that we can translate what you guys are finding, right, as ecologists, as biologists, as natural scientists, what you are finding in terms of the ecosystems, we can translate that to a language that policymakers speak, right? And that is money, right? So we can value those ecosystem services. Again, I want to be clear about this, not because we want to price those ecosystems services, but because we want to show the relevance, the importance that those systems have for the economy, for the well-being of local populations or the global population as well, right? So it is about putting on the table, putting in front of policymakers how valuable these resources are, right? And one language that they understand is money, right?
I think at that point, I will close off the questions. Once again, William, let me thank you for a very interesting talk. As you said a couple of times, and I agree with you entirely, the conversation between economists and those of us in the natural sciences are certainly important, and I thank you for bringing the conversation to us today. And I just want to let people know that our speaker next week will be Professor Raymond Ward from Queen Mary University of London in the UK. And he will be talking on productivity, biomass, and carbon cycling, geographical patterns and regional trends in relation to mangroves. So I hope you all join us at the same time next week. And thank you for joining us today. So bye for all now. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.